Captain Jake Morgan's boots crunched through the ash and debris of what used to be a thriving Valian settlement. The sky above was still dark, choked with smoke from the fires that had swept through just hours before. His tactical suit sensors blinked warnings across his visor, reminding him what he already knew: they were running out of time. The Krath Empire didn't believe in second chances. Their insectoid warriors had torn through this sector like a plague, and their doctrine was simple and brutal. First wave destroys resistance. Second wave erases everything else. No survivors. No witnesses. No mercy. Jake's extraction team moved quickly through the ruins, their scanners sweeping for life signs. They'd already loaded 32 Valian refugees onto the transport shuttles. Most were injured. All were traumatized. The reptilian species had been peaceful farmers and artisans, barely past their industrial age. They'd never stood a chance against the Krath war machine. "Captain, we've got maybe 90 minutes before the second wave hits," his pilot radioed in. The voice belonged to Tom Hayes, a steady guy from Colorado who'd flown rescue missions in 3 different wars. "Command screaming at us to wrap up and bug out." Jake acknowledged and kept moving through what looked like it had been a marketplace. Overturned stalls. Scattered goods. A child's toy lying in the dust, one of those simple wooden things that every species seemed to create regardless of how advanced their technology got. It reminded him of the toy truck his daughter had loved when she was little. That's when he saw her. A small Valian child, couldn't have been more than 4 years old by their standards, stood perfectly still beside a collapsed building. Her scales, normally a vibrant green according to the cultural briefings, had gone pale and gray with shock. She clutched a broken data slate against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in her universe. Behind her, Jake could see the crushed remains of what had clearly been someone's home. Maybe hers. Probably hers. He started toward her, but his helmet display lit up with an incoming priority signal. Admiral Vosk's four-eyed face filled his screen. The Zen 3 military coordinator looked as cold and efficient as always, his mandibles clicking with what might have been impatience or just the way his species talked. Hard to tell sometimes, even after years of working together. "Captain Morgan, I'm reviewing your transport manifest in real time," Vosk said without preamble. "I see you've stopped near an unregistered juvenile. Coalition evacuation protocol is crystal clear on this. We prioritize based on strategic value and survival probability. The Valians have no military assets, no technological advantages to offer, and their remaining population is statistically insignificant. She stays behind." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "Sir, with respect, she's just a kid. She can't be more than." "She is a resource drain we cannot afford," Vosk interrupted, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd made up their mind before the conversation even started. "Your transport's life support system is already operating at 110% capacity. Every biological signature we add increases the risk of cascade failure. You have 4 to 7 souls aboard those shuttles, Captain. 4 to 7 coalition species personnel who serve important functions in the war effort. I will not risk their lives for one juvenile of a species that offers nothing to our cause." Jake looked at the child again. She hadn't moved. Hadn't even seemed to notice him standing there. She was locked in that terrible stillness that came with trauma, the kind he'd seen too many times in too many wars. "Sir, our life support can handle one more small." "This is not a negotiation, Captain Morgan." Vosk's mandibles clicked harder now, a sign Jake had learned meant the Admiral was getting angry. "I am looking at the same technical readouts you are. Your environmental systems are strained. Your water recyclers are running hot. Your CO2 scrubbers are operating beyond recommended parameters. Adding another biological signature, even a small one, could push everything into the red zone. And then what happens? System failure. 4 to 7 dead instead of 1 left behind. Is that the math you want on your conscience?" The numbers made sense. Jake knew they made sense. He'd been in command long enough to understand the brutal calculus of war, the impossible choices that came with limited resources and unlimited need. Save 10 or save 1. Save your squad or save civilians. Complete the mission or risk everything for people you'd never met. But understanding the math and accepting it were 2 different things. "Captain, I need an immediate confirmation that you are proceeding to your transport and departing on schedule," Vosk continued. "The Krath fleet will be in weapons range in approximately 87 minutes. If you are not off-planet by then, I cannot guarantee orbital support for extraction. You will be stranded in an active combat zone with no reinforcements available." Jake's team was watching him now. He could feel their attention even without looking. They knew what was happening. They'd all heard the transmission on the shared comm channel. Lieutenant Danny Brooks, his second-in-command from Texas, had gone very quiet. Corporal Lisa Chen, their medic, had stopped moving entirely. The Valian child finally moved. She looked up at him with those large, intelligent eyes that her species had. There was no hope in them. Just emptiness. Like she'd already accepted what was coming, had already made peace with dying alone in the ruins of everything she'd ever known. Jake thought about his own daughter back on Earth. Thought about what he'd want someone to do if she was standing there instead. Thought about all the high-minded speeches about coalition values and protecting the innocent and standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Then he thought about how meaningless those speeches were if they only applied when it was convenient. He reached up and muted his connection to Admiral Vosk. Knelt down in the ash. Took off his helmet so the child could see his face, see that he was a person and not just another armored figure in a nightmare. His tactical computer immediately started beeping warnings about atmospheric contaminants, but he ignored them. "Hey there," he said softly. His suit's translator converted the words into Valian phonetics. "My name's Jake. What's yours?" The child's cheap refugee translator collar flickered weakly. "Kira," she whispered. "That's a real pretty name, Kira." Jake extended his hand slowly, the way you would with a frightened animal. "I know everything's scary right now. I know your whole world just got turned upside down. But I'm gonna make you a promise, okay? I'm not leaving you here. Not today. Not ever." His helmet comm was screaming now with incoming messages from Vosk. Jake could imagine what they said. Threats of court-martial. Orders to comply immediately. Maybe even threats to override his command and launch the transports remotely. He didn't care. Jake scooped up Kira gently. She weighed almost nothing in the planet's lower gravity. Turned toward the transport. His team parted silently as he walked through them, and he saw something in their faces that made him know he'd made the right choice, regardless of what happened next. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Sometimes being human meant refusing to act like a machine. The transport ramp was waiting. 3 weeks after the evacuation, Jake found himself standing in the coldest room he'd ever been in, and it had nothing to do with temperature. The Coalition Military Tribunal chamber was all hard angles and harder stairs, designed to make you feel small and insignificant. 9 judges sat on an elevated platform, looking down at him like ancient gods passing judgment on a mortal who'd forgotten his place. 5 of them were Zenthari, their multiple eyes unblinking and their mandibles clicking in that unsettling way that always reminded Jake of insects. 2 were Korasian, their crystalline bodies refracting the harsh overhead lights. 1 was Drithian, looking like a small mountain carved into roughly humanoid shape. And 1, just 1, was human. General Frank Carter, a man who'd served with Jake's father decades ago during the First Contact Wars. Admiral Vosk stood at the prosecutor's position, and Jake had to admit the guy was thorough. He'd brought everything. Comm recordings. Satellite footage. Testimony from the transport's AI systems. Technical readouts of the life support systems. Even psychological profiles suggesting Jake had a history of emotional decision-making that compromised his judgment. "The charges are straightforward," Vosk began, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into flat, emotionless standard. "Willful disobedience of direct orders during combat operations. Reckless endangerment of coalition personnel. Theft of military resources, specifically 1 transport shuttle and associated fuel costs. And violation of Protocol 7G regarding triage priorities during contested evacuations." He paused, letting that sink in. "The evidence is irrefutable. Captain Morgan knowingly and deliberately violated explicit commands from a superior officer, jeopardizing the lives of 4 to 7 military and civilian personnel for the sake of a single juvenile belonging to a species with no strategic value to coalition interests." The recordings played on holographic displays that floated in the air between them. There was Jake's voice, clear as day, saying "No, sir" when given a direct order. There was the satellite footage showing him picking up Kira and boarding the transport. There was the technical data showing life support systems running beyond recommended parameters. It all looked damning because it was damning. Jake hadn't tried to hide what he'd done. Couldn't have even if he'd wanted to. Every moment of that extraction had been recorded by multiple systems, and in the modern military, there was no such thing as plausible deniability. The lead judge, the massive Drithian whose name Jake could barely pronounce, leaned forward. His voice rumbled like continental plates grinding together. "Captain Morgan, do you dispute any of the facts as presented?" Jake stood straighter. "No, Your Honor. It all happened exactly like Admiral Vosk said." Do you have anything to say in your defense before we deliberate? Jake had spent 3 weeks working on a speech with the defense attorney the coalition had assigned him. 20 pages of carefully worded arguments about the spirit of coalition law versus the letter of it. About how Protocol 7G had been written during a different kind of war and needed updating. About precedents and exceptions and mitigating circumstances. Standing there, though, looking at those 9 alien faces and the one human one, Jake found he couldn't deliver any of it. The words felt hollow and calculated, like he was trying to lawyer his way out of something he'd done with his whole heart. So he just told them the truth. When humanity first made contact with the rest of the galaxy, we were terrified, Jake said. We'd spent our whole history thinking we were alone, and then suddenly we find out we're basically toddlers in a universe full of civilizations millions of years older than us. The Zen-3 found us first. He nodded toward Admiral Vosk. Your people could have done anything to us. Enslaved us. Exploited us. Just ignored us completely. But you didn't. You offered us a seat at the table because you said all sentient life had value. That's what the coalition was supposed to be about. He took a breath, aware that every word was being recorded and would follow him for the rest of his life. I believe that. Still do. When I looked at Kira standing there in those ruins, I didn't see a strategic value calculation. I didn't see resource consumption metrics or survival probability percentages. I saw a kid who just watched her whole world burn. A kid who was going to die alone and scared if I got back on that transport without her. So yeah, I broke the rules. I disobeyed orders. I risked my crew. And if I had to do it again, I'd make the exact same choice. Because if we're not willing to save one child, what exactly are we fighting this war for? Noble sentiments, Vosk clicked, his tone dripping with disdain. But wars are not won with sentiment, Captain. They are won with discipline, with strategy, with the willingness to make difficult choices. The Krath Empire expands because they are willing to sacrifice anything for victory. If we indulge in emotional responses every time we encounter, if we become them to defeat them, then who cares who wins? General Carter interrupted, speaking for the first time. His voice was gravelly, worn down by decades of service. Permission to present evidence for the defense. The judges conferred briefly in languages Jake didn't understand, then the Drithian nodded. Carter activated his own holographic display. This is the transport manifest from Captain Morgan's extraction run. Official capacity was 47 personnel. The actual survival rate after the 3-week journey back to friendly space was 100%. That's 47 original passengers plus 1 Valian juvenile, all alive and healthy. He pulled up more data, charts and graphs that painted a picture Jake hadn't even known existed. Here's what actually happened on that transport. When the life support systems started straining under the extra load, the human crew implemented rotating rest cycles to reduce their metabolic output. The Coruscant traders, who according to their intake interviews actively disliked humans before this mission, voluntarily reduced their environmental temperature preferences by 15 degrees to conserve energy. A Zen-3 engineer named Kravok redesigned the carbon dioxide scrubber system on the fly, improving efficiency by 8%. A Silvari doctor taught everyone breathing exercises to reduce oxygen consumption. Carter let that information hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Admiral Vosk claims Captain Morgan endangered 47 lives. I submit that he did the exact opposite. He reminded those 47 people what they were fighting for, and they responded by becoming more than any of us thought they could be. They worked together. They sacrificed together. They proved that when you give people something worth fighting for, they'll find ways to make the impossible happen. He turned to face Jake directly, and there was something in the old general's eyes that looked almost like pride. I've been in this coalition military for 30 years. Watched us integrate species after species into a functional fighting force. And you want to know what I've learned? Humanity doesn't bring better weapons. We don't have superior tactics or more advanced technology. What we bring is harder to quantify. We bring this stubborn, irrational, completely illogical belief that every single life matters. Even when the math says otherwise. Especially when the math says otherwise. And somehow, some way, that belief makes everyone around us better. This is absurd, Vosk hissed, his mandibles clicking rapidly. You cannot run a military organization on feelings and wishful thinking. No, Carter agreed quietly. But you can't build a civilization worth defending without them either. The tribunal chamber went silent. Jake stood there, barely breathing, watching the judges look at each other with those alien expressions he could never quite read. His whole career hung in the balance. Maybe his freedom too. Courts-martial for disobeying orders in combat could mean prison time. But standing there, even facing that, Jake couldn't make himself regret picking up that scared little girl in the ruins. Some things were worth the cost. The judges deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours of Jake sitting in a windowless holding room, staring at grey walls and wondering if he'd just thrown away everything he'd worked for his entire adult life. His commission. His reputation. Maybe even his freedom. When they finally called him back, the Drithian judge's face was completely unreadable. His voice carried that same grinding stone quality that made every word sound like a pronouncement from the universe itself. Captain Jacob Morgan, this tribunal finds you guilty of willful disobedience of direct orders during combat operations. Jake's stomach dropped. He'd known it was coming, but hearing it out loud still hit like a punch to the gut. However, the judge continued, and Jake's head snapped up. This tribunal also finds that Coalition Protocol 7G, as currently written and implemented, is fundamentally inadequate to address the moral and ethical complexities of modern multispecies warfare. The protocol will be remanded to the full Coalition Council for comprehensive review and revision. Wait. What? General Carter took over, and Jake could swear he saw the tiniest hint of a smile on the old man's weathered face. Captain Morgan, you are hereby sentenced to 30 days of administrative duty and a formal reprimand in your permanent record. However, you will retain your rank and commission. Furthermore, you are being reassigned to a new position, Special Advocate for Emergency Evacuation Ethics, reporting directly to the Coalition Council. Your job will be to help develop new training protocols that balance strategic necessity with humanitarian imperatives. Jake stood there, completely stunned. Sir, I don't understand. I broke the rules. I disobeyed a direct order. Yes, you did, Carter agreed. And in doing so, you proved the rules were broken to begin with. Now we need you to help fix them. Do you accept this assignment, Captain? Jake thought about Kira, safe now in a refugee center on New Harmony Station. Thought about all the other kids on all the other burning worlds, caught between policy and survival. Yes, sir. I accept. The real work started immediately. What Jake didn't know, couldn't have known sitting in that tribunal, was that his story had already spread far beyond that courtroom. In the 3 weeks between his evacuation run and the court-martial, something unexpected had happened. People had started talking. It began in the mess halls and recreation areas, the places where soldiers gathered away from the brass and the official channels. Someone had leaked the comm recordings. Someone else had shared the satellite footage. Within days, every extraction team in 3 sectors had heard about the human captain who told an admiral to shove his orders and saved a kid anyway. And something shifted. 2 weeks after Jake's reassignment, a young Zen-3 officer named Kelso was running an evacuation on a colony world in the Outer Rim. Standard operation, refugees fleeing ahead of a Krath advance. They'd loaded up to capacity and were about to dust off when Kelso's scanner picked up a faint biosign under a collapsed building. Lieutenant, we are at maximum capacity, his commander said over the comm. Leave them and board immediately. Kelso stood there, claws hovering over the rubble, thinking about the story he'd heard. About a human who'd looked at the rules and decided some things mattered more. Sir, with respect, Kelso said, and started digging. What would Captain Morgan do? Long pause on the other end. Then, he'd dig, wouldn't he? Damn humans and their infectious morality. Fine. 2 minutes. Not 1 second longer. They pulled a Silvari child from the rubble. She was crying, clutching a small flowering plant that had somehow survived whatever hell had destroyed the settlement. Kelso cradled her carefully in his primary arms as they made for the transport. His commander never mentioned it in the official report. But Kelso told the story to his squad. And they told it to others. And it spread. 3 sectors away, a Coruscant transport pilot named Thesic was arguing with her commanding officer about leaving behind a group of elderly Valians. They are too slow, the commander insisted. We'll miss our launch window. Captain Morgan didn't leave someone behind because they were inconvenient, Thesic replied, her crystalline body flickering with determination. Neither will I. They made the launch window. Barely. But they made it. The stories multiplied. A human medic named Rachel who'd spent 3 extra hours searching collapsed buildings on a mining colony, finding 2 families everyone else had written off as dead. A Drithian engineer named Krager who'd redesigned his transport's environmental systems on the fly to fit 15 more refugees than regulations allowed. A mixed-species crew that had worked 72 hours straight, refusing to leave a disaster zone until every biosign had been accounted for. They started calling it the Morgan Standard. Not officially, of course. No regulation or protocol bore that name. But in the informal networks that existed beneath the military hierarchy, everyone knew what it meant. When faced with the choice between following orders and doing what was right, you did what was right and figured out the consequences later. Jake learned about all this gradually, in bits and pieces, as he traveled between coalition bases developing his new training protocols. He'd walk into a mess hall and conversations would stop. People would nod at him with respect that felt unearned. Once, a grizzled Zenthari sergeant with scars across half his carapace approached him and said simply, "My granddaughter is alive because someone on her colony remembered your example. Thank you." Jake never knew what to say to things like that. He'd just done what felt right in the moment. The idea that it had become something bigger, something that was changing how people thought about their duty, felt surreal. 18 months after the court-martial, Jake stood in the Coalition Council chamber, a massive space where representatives from 47 species gathered to debate the future of their alliance. He was there to present the final version of the revised evacuation protocols. His hands were sweating. He'd faced down Krath's shock troops with less nervousness. "The core principle is simple," Jake explained, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Strategic value cannot be the sole determining factor in rescue operations. We've developed a matrix that weighs immediate threat level, transport capacity, mission parameters, and yes, strategic considerations. But it also includes mandatory ethical review thresholds. If we're about to leave someone behind, we have to be able to justify why with more than just numbers." A Zenthari counselor raised a claw. "And if there is genuine conflict? If the choice truly is between saving one or losing many?" "Then we make the hard choice," Jake admitted. "I'm not saying every situation has a perfect answer. But we make it honestly, acknowledging the cost. And here's what we've learned over the past year and a half. 17 major extraction operations have used these new protocols. We saved 340 additional individuals who would have been abandoned under the old system. And we lost nobody. 0 casualties among rescue personnel or evacuees." A murmur ran through the chamber. Even the counselors who'd been skeptical looked impressed. "How is this possible?" a Coruscant representative asked. "Because people work harder when they believe what they're doing matters," Jake said simply. "Give them permission to care, and they find ways to make miracles happen. They redesign systems on the fly. They volunteer for extra shifts. They solve problems we didn't even know had solutions. Not because they are ordered to, but because they want to. Because they remember what they are fighting for." Admiral Vosk was in the military observer section. Jake could see him there, silent and stone-faced. The Admiral had opposed the new protocols initially, but he'd eventually implemented them in his own fleet. Hard to argue with a perfect safety record. After the presentation, as Jake was gathering his materials, he was approached by an unexpected visitor. Kira stood there, nearly 2 years older now, wearing the silver collar that marked her as a coalition refugee with provisional citizenship status. She'd grown. Learned. Started healing from trauma that should have broken her. "Captain Morgan," she said in carefully practiced standard. "I wanted to thank you." Jake knelt down, bringing himself to her level like he had that first day. "You don't need to thank me, Kira. I just did what anyone should have done." "But you did it when others would not," she replied, holding up a data pad. "I have been studying. Learning about Earth, about humans, about the Coalition. I want to understand why you saved me when the Admiral said my species had no value." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Because value isn't about what you can offer right now. It's about potential, about possibility, about the simple fact that you exist and that matters. My species learned something a long time ago through hard experience. We learned that civilization isn't measured by technology or weapons. It's measured by who you choose to be when it would be easier to be cruel." Kira looked at him with those large, intelligent eyes. "I will remember this. When I am older, I will remember that someone chose to see me as worthy." "You were always worthy, Kira. Always." The war dragged on for another 3 years after that day in the council chamber. 3 more years of battles and losses, of worlds burned and lives shattered. The Krath kept pushing, kept expanding their empire of ash and bone, and the Coalition kept pushing back. But something had changed in the way they fought. Jake saw it everywhere he went. He'd visit a forward operating base on some contested border world, and the crews would have unofficial patches sewn inside their uniforms. A hand reaching down through flames, pulling another hand up. No words needed. Everyone knew what it meant. The Morgan Standard. It wasn't in any regulation. No official directive mentioned it. But it had become part of the coalition's identity anyway, spreading through the ranks like a beneficial virus. Junior officers made decisions their training said were tactically unsound, and somehow those decisions worked out. Crews pushed their equipment past breaking points and found those breaking points were further than anyone had calculated. People simply tried harder because they believed what they were doing mattered beyond the strategic objectives. Jake heard the stories constantly. They came from every corner of coalition space, from species he'd never even met. There was the story of Commander Helen Reed, a transport pilot from New Australia, who'd been ordered to evacuate a science station ahead of a Krath raid. Standard procedure said take the scientists and their critical research, leave everything else. Helen had looked at the station's support staff, the cooks and maintenance workers and janitors who kept the place running, and said no. She'd made 3 trips instead of 1, risking her ship and crew each time. Got everyone out. The research was important, she'd said in her after-action report, but so were the people who made breakfast every morning. They'd reprimanded her officially. Given her a medal unofficially. There was the Zen 3 battalion commander named Vestok who'd been ordered to hold a strategic choke point at all costs. Standard doctrine was clear, no resources diverted for civilian concerns. But Vestok had noticed a refugee camp 2 kilometers from his position, directly in the path of the Krath advance. He'd sent a third of his forces to evacuate that camp, weakening his primary defensive line. Military analysts said it should have been a disaster. Instead, the refugees had included a retired Coruscant engineer who'd helped Vestok's forces set up a sensor network that gave them advance warning of every Krath flanking attempt. They'd held that choke point for 3 weeks, long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Vestok's commanding officer had demanded to know what he'd been thinking, splitting his forces like that. I was thinking about what Captain Morgan would do, Vestok had replied simply. The stories kept coming. A human field medic named Tyler who'd crawled through active fire to reach wounded civilians in a collapsed bunker. A Sylvari intelligence officer named Thessie who'd blown her cover to warn a village about an incoming Krath bombardment. A mixed species extraction team that had refused to leave a disaster zone until they'd accounted for every single life sign, working themselves to exhaustion and beyond. The Morgan Standard wasn't about following orders. It was about remembering what the orders were supposed to be for in the first place. Of course, not everyone was happy about it. Jake sat through more than one heated meeting where senior officers complained about discipline breaking down, about soldiers second-guessing commands, about the chaos of everyone thinking they could make their own decisions in the field. This is exactly what I warned about, Admiral Vosk said during one particularly tense strategy session. We are losing operational cohesion. Units are deviating from established protocols based on emotional responses rather than tactical analysis. General Carter, now promoted to the Coalition Joint Chiefs, had leaned back in his chair and smiled. And yet our casualty rates are down 17% year-over-year. Civilian deaths in contested zones have dropped by 40%. Recruitment and retention are at all-time highs across every species. Morale is the best it's been since the war started. So tell me, Admiral, what exactly is the problem? Vosk's mandibles had clicked in frustration. The problem is unpredictability. How do we plan operations when we cannot rely on our forces to follow established doctrine? Maybe we need better doctrine, Carter had replied. That was the fundamental tension. The old guard wanted order, predictability, the clean mathematical certainty of strategic planning. The new generation, the ones who'd grown up with the Morgan Standard, wanted something messier but more human. They wanted room to care, permission to see the people behind the tactical symbols on their maps. Jake found himself caught in the middle, trying to write training protocols that somehow balanced both needs. It was like trying to teach people how to have compassion, which felt ridiculous. Either you cared about others or you didn't. Either you saw a scared kid in the ruins and felt compelled to help, or you saw a resource drain to be calculated. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the protocols weren't about teaching compassion. Maybe they were about giving people permission to act on the compassion they already felt. The breakthrough came during a training exercise Jake was observing on a coalition base near the Orion sector. A simulated evacuation scenario, the kind they ran constantly to prepare crews for real operations. The scenario was brutal by design, a colony under attack, limited time, limited resources, impossible choices. Jake watched as a young human lieutenant named Casey, fresh out of the academy, stood at the command station. The simulation threw problem after problem at her. Not enough transport capacity. Critical equipment that needed evacuation. VIP personnel who had to be prioritized. And then, right at the end, a group of civilians trapped in a collapsed shelter. The math was clear. Saving them would mean leaving behind valuable equipment. The scenario expected her to make the hard choice, to prioritize strategic assets over individuals. Casey had stared at the display for a long moment. Then she turned to her simulated crew and started giving orders. Reroute power from non-essential systems. Compress the cargo. Have the VIPs double up in quarters meant for one. Strip out every piece of equipment that wasn't absolutely critical. Make room. The simulation's AI had flagged multiple protocol violations. Casey's instructor, a Zen 3 officer, had started to intervene. But Jake had held up a hand, watching. Casey's simulated crew had worked with desperate efficiency, finding solutions the scenario designers hadn't anticipated. They'd gotten everyone out, equipment and all, with 40 seconds to spare before the enemy arrived. The instructor had pulled up the statistics afterward, shaking his head in disbelief. This scenario has a design failure rate of 60%. It's supposed to teach officers about acceptable losses. How did you? I asked myself what Captain Morgan would do, Casey had said. And then I figured out how to make it work. That's when Jake realized something. The Morgan standard wasn't making soldiers less disciplined. It was making them more creative. When you told people that every life mattered and then put them in impossible situations, they didn't just accept the impossibility. They found third options, solutions that existed outside the binary of the scenario. They became better. Jake included that training exercise in his final report to the Coalition Council. Added dozens more examples like it. Showed how the new protocols weren't just about ethics, they were about effectiveness. Compassion and capability weren't opposing forces. They reinforced each other. The Krath Empire was winning through brutality and ruthless efficiency. The Coalition would win through something they couldn't match, the stubborn human belief that there was always another way, always a solution, always hope. Even when the math said otherwise. Especially when the math said otherwise. The Krath War finally ended on a Tuesday. Jake would always remember that detail, how something so massive and world-changing happened on the most ordinary day of the week. After 7 years of grinding conflict, the Krath Empire's central hive world sued for peace. They'd learned what countless other aggressors throughout history had learned the hard way: you can conquer territory, but you can't conquer the human spirit or the idea it spreads. The Coalition had won, but the cost had been staggering. Entire worlds reduced to rubble. Billions dead. Refugees scattered across 100 star systems, trying to rebuild lives from the ashes of everything they'd known. And that's where the real work began. 20 years after Jake had picked up a scared little girl in the ruins, he sat in the Grand Assembly Hall on Unity Station, watching the newest class of Coalition diplomatic officers graduate. He was older now, with gray threading through his hair and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He'd been promoted twice more, though he still felt weird about people calling him Admiral Morgan. The graduation ceremony was always his favorite day of the year. Watching young people from dozens of species, all of them committed to building something better than what had come before. All of them believers in the idea that civilization meant more than just winning wars. The valedictorian this year was Valian. Jake had known that for months, had helped write the letter of recommendation that got her into the program. But sitting there watching her walk to the podium, he still felt a surge of pride that caught him off guard. Kira had grown into a confident young woman, her scales now the vibrant green that indicated a healthy, thriving member of her species. She wore the formal robes of a diplomatic officer with easy grace, and when she spoke, her standard was flawless. 20 years ago, Kira began, her voice carrying through the massive hall, I was a child standing in the ruins of my home. Everything I knew was gone. Everyone I loved was dead. I had no future because I didn't believe I had a tomorrow. The hall went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. A human officer found me that day. His orders were clear, leave me behind. I was, as his superior officer put it, strategically irrelevant. My species had nothing to offer the war effort. Saving me would risk dozens of other lives. The math was simple, and the math said I should die. Kira paused, her large eyes sweeping across the audience of graduates, faculty, and guests. Captain Jake Morgan, now Admiral Morgan, looked at that math and decided it was wrong. Not incorrect in its calculations, but wrong in what it was calculating. He saw something his training and his orders told him to ignore. He saw me. Not as a resource drain or a tactical liability. Just as a person who needed help. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd never gotten used to being the center of these stories, even after 2 decades of hearing variations of them. Admiral Morgan has told me many times that I owe him no debt, Kira continued. He insists he only did what anyone should have done. But he's wrong about that. What he did was extraordinary, not because saving a child should be extraordinary, but because in that moment, in that situation, choosing compassion over compliance was an act of revolution. She pulled up a holographic display, images floating in the air above the podium. Faces. Hundreds of them. Thousands. All different species, all different ages. These are the people alive today because someone, somewhere, remembered Captain Morgan's choice and made a similar one. The Silvari children pulled from a collapsed school by a Zen 3 unit that stayed 30 minutes past their extraction window. The elderly Caraxians evacuated by a human transport crew that made 4 trips instead of 1. The Drithian refugees saved by a mixed-species team that refused to accept the word impossible. The images kept cycling. So many faces. So many lives that almost weren't. The Morgan Standard isn't written in any official regulation. You won't find it in your training manuals or operational procedures. But every person in this room knows what it means. It means that when you're faced with a choice between what's easy and what's right, you choose right. When the math says you can't save everyone, you find a way to change the math. When orders conflict with conscience, you follow your conscience and deal with the consequences. Kira's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Some of our instructors have worried that this philosophy makes us less disciplined, less effective as officers. I respectfully disagree. The Morgan Standard doesn't make us worse at our jobs. It reminds us what our jobs actually are. We're not here to win arguments about strategic value. We're here to build a civilization where every person, regardless of their species or status or usefulness, has inherent worth. Jake noticed Admiral Vosk sitting 3 rows ahead of him. The Zen 3 officer had softened over the years, had even become something like a friend. Jake saw Vosk's mandibles clicking in what he'd learned to recognize as approval. I stand before you today as living proof of what happens when someone chooses compassion over convenience, Kira said. I've spent the last 4 years studying diplomacy, conflict resolution, and interspecies relations. I've learned 6 languages. I've written papers on post-war reconstruction and refugee integration. Next month, I begin my assignment with the Coalition Refugee Relocation Committee, where I'll help displaced families find new homes and new hope. She paused, and Jake could see tears forming in her large eyes. None of that would exist if Admiral Morgan had followed his orders that day. I wouldn't exist. And every person I'm going to help in my career, every family I'm going to relocate, every child I'm going to comfort, none of that would happen either. One act of defiance created ripples that are still spreading, still touching lives, still changing the galaxy. The audience was completely transfixed now. Even the faculty members who'd heard dozens of graduation speeches looked moved. So here's what I want to say to my fellow graduates, Kira continued, looking directly at the rows of young officers in their formal uniforms. We're walking into a galaxy that's still healing from war. We're going to face impossible situations and terrible choices. There will be times when the easy path and the right path diverge. When they do, remember this moment. Remember that every person you meet has the potential to change the world if given the chance. Remember that compassion isn't weakness, it's strength. And remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to leave someone behind. She looked directly at Jake, and he saw the little girl he'd carried through the ash and the accomplished woman she'd become, both somehow existing in the same moment. Admiral Morgan, you've told me I don't owe you anything. But I disagree. I owe you my life, yes, but more than that, I owe you an example worth following. So thank you. Thank you for being human in the best possible sense of that word. Thank you for showing the galaxy what we're capable of when we choose to care. And thank you for proving that one person, making one choice, can change everything. The applause started slowly, then built into something thunderous. The entire hall stood, species who normally remained seated during human customs rising to their feet. The ovation went on for minutes. Jake sat there, overwhelmed, thinking about that day in the ruins. He'd never planned to start a movement. He'd just seen a scared kid and couldn't walk away. Everything that came after, all these years of change and growth and transformation, had grown from that single moment of refusing to accept that some lives mattered less than others. After the ceremony, Jake found Kira in the crowded reception hall. She was surrounded by well-wishers, but she excused herself when she saw him approaching. That was quite a speech, Jake said. I meant every word, Kira replied. She hugged him, and Jake returned it, marveling at how normal it had become, this friendship across species lines. You're going to do amazing things, Jake told her. I'm so proud of you. I learned from the best. She pulled back, looking at him seriously. Jake, I need to tell you something. The Refugee Relocation Committee is sending me to the Outer Rim. There are thousands of Krath civilians there, refugees from their own collapsed empire. Most species won't work with them because of the war. They're stuck in camps, their children growing up with no future. Jake understood immediately. You're going to help them. I'm going to try. Because someone once showed me that your worth isn't determined by your species or your past or what you can offer. It's determined by the simple fact that you exist. She smiled. Besides, what would Captain Morgan do? Jake laughed, shaking his head. That question is going to follow me to my grave, isn't it? I certainly hope so. It's a good question. Maybe the most important question. 20 years after breaking orders to save one life, Jake stood in a hall full of young idealists ready to change the galaxy, and he realized something. The war was over, but the real victory wasn't in defeating the Krath. It was in creating a civilization that valued compassion as much as strategy, that saw every person as worth saving. The Morgan Standard had started with one scared human carrying one scared child through the ruins. But it had become something bigger than either of them. It had become a belief system, a philosophy, a revolution in how the galaxy thought about itself. And it all came down to one simple idea: everyone matters. Even when the math says otherwise. Especially when the math says otherwise. That was humanity's real gift to the stars. Not better weapons or faster ships. Just the stubborn, irrational, completely illogical belief that every life has value. And somehow, against all odds, the galaxy had decided to believe it too. Retry.